Her own family sold her to the mines. In that place of endless suffering, her life was worth less than the salt she carried. She was forgotten by the world, but not by him. The silent lord of the keep, a man trapped in a prison of his own making, haunted by a past he could not escape. He watched her from the shadows, seeing the kindness she still offered to others, even in her own despair. And in her darkest moment, he stepped from the darkness and bought her freedom with a single coin, trading her chains for the walls of his silent castle. She feared her new master, but she would soon discover it was his heart, not her body, that was truly captive. The sound that sealed her fate was not a judge's gavel or a king's decree. It was the simple, ugly clink of 4 silver coins hitting a stained wooden table. Elara watched them settle, her own value counted out, and found sufficient. Her father Bren did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the coins, his hand already reaching for them, his knuckles white with a mixture of greed and shame. A rough hand gripped her arm, the fingers digging into her flesh like a brand. This was it. This was the end of the world she knew. She was pushed from the smoky tavern into the biting wind, the door shutting behind her on the only home she had ever had. The man who bought her, a recruiter for the salt mines of Viridia, shoved her toward a cage on wheels, already crowded with other lost souls. There were no goodbyes, there were no last words of comfort. There was only the scrape of the iron latch and the finality of the cage door slamming shut. As the cart lurched forward, she did not look back. There was nothing left to see. The journey was a blur of misery. Days bled into nights, measured only by the gnawing ache of hunger and the relentless rattling of the cart over frozen, rutted roads. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The faces around her were hollow, their eyes vacant, already resigned to the crushing weight of their new reality. Elara felt a cold numbness creep into her heart, a dangerous fog that threatened to extinguish the small flame of her spirit. She was no longer a daughter or a neighbor. She was cargo. When they finally arrived, the sight stole what little breath she had left. The salt mines of Viridia were not a place of work, but a wound upon the earth, a great pale gash carved into the landscape, descending into darkness. The air tasted of brine and sorrow. A man with a cruel face and a leather whip looped at his belt unlocked the cage. His name was Grizz, the mine overseer, and he looked at them not as people, but as tools, assessing their strength and their breaking points with a practiced eye. "Into the pit with you," he snarled, his voice like grinding rocks. "Here, you have no name. You have a pickaxe and a quota. Fail to meet it, and you will learn what pain tastes like." Her first day in the mine was a descent into hell. The salt dust was a constant torment, clinging to her skin, stinging her eyes, and catching in her throat with every ragged breath. It found every small cut and scrape on her hands, setting them on fire with an agony that never subsided. The work was brutal, a repetitive rhythm of swinging a pickaxe that was too heavy for her arms and hauling loads of salt rock that strained every muscle in her back. Around her, the sounds were of coughing, of weeping, and of the sharp crack of Grizz's whip. Hope was a foreign currency. Here! By midday, Elara's body screamed for release. Her spirit wavered, whispering that it would be so easy to simply fall, to let the darkness take her. It would be a mercy. But then she saw her, a girl younger than Elara, with fear-bright eyes and a frame so thin it seemed a strong wind could break her. The girl, whose name she would learn was Lyra, stumbled, dropping her load of rock. Grizz was on her in an instant, his whip uncoiling with a sick hiss. The blow landed with a wet crack, and the girl cried out, curling into a ball on the salty ground. Something inside Elara shifted. The fog of her own despair cleared, replaced by a sharp, protective anger. She could not stop the whip, not yet, but she would not let this place extinguish everything she was. Later, when a meager ration of hard bread and gray water was passed out, Elara found the girl huddled in a corner, trembling. Lyra's eyes were wide with a terror that looked permanent. Without a second thought, Elara broke her. own small piece of bread in half and knelt, offering it to the girl. Lyra stared, uncomprehending. Kindness was not something that lived in this pit. "Take it," Elara whispered, her voice hoarse. "You need the strength." The girl snatched the bread and ate it with desperate ferocity. It was a small act, a gesture that went unseen by the overseers. But in the crushing darkness of the mine, it was a tiny spark of light, a defiance not of rules, but of the despair that was meant to be their true master. As the shift ended and the workers were herded back toward the squalid barracks, a nervous murmur rippled through the exhausted crowd. A guard announced the reason, his voice holding a tremor of fear. "The Lord of the Keep arrives for inspection on the morrow. Look busy, look silent, do not meet his gaze." The name was not spoken, but a shared terror washed over the workers, a fear even greater than the one they held for Grizz and his whip. Elara saw men who had endured beatings without. A sound now makes signs to ward off evil. She saw women pull their children closer, their faces pale with dread. She looked from the terrified faces around her to the dark, imposing silhouette of the castle on the hill, a place of shadows and secrets. Who was this lord, this man whose silence inspired more fear than any whip or shouted threat? Tomorrow she would find out, and a cold certainty settled in her stomach that whatever hope she had found today would be extinguished by the morning. Morning air was thick with a fear so dense it felt like its own kind of dust. The workers moved with a frantic, desperate energy, their bodies aching, but their terror overriding the pain. The Lord of the Keep was coming. Grizz stalked the mine pits like a rabid dog, his whip cracking at the slightest provocation. He wanted the mine to look productive, orderly. He wanted to be invisible to the silent lord he served and feared. Elara kept her head down, her world narrowed to the swing of her pickaxe and the weight of the salt rock. She tried to make herself small, to fade into the gray landscape of the mine. Beside her, the young girl, Lyra, trembled, her small face streaked with tears and salt. Then a hush fell. It was not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, suffocating blanket of silence. The cracking of the whip stopped. The coughing of the workers died in their throats. Every soul in the pit froze. He was here. Lord Kalin stood at the edge of the pit, a tall, cloaked figure, silhouetted against the pale sky. His face was partially hidden by the shadows of his hood, but a jagged scar was visible on the hard line of his jaw. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone was an iron weight, pressing down on all of them. For Kalin, this place was a penance, a monthly pilgrimage into the heart of human misery, a reminder of the ugliness he felt he deserved to witness. He expected nothing but greed, cruelty, and despair. It was always the same. It was Lyra who broke the spell. Weakened and terrified, her small foot slipped on a loose rock. The basket of salt she was carrying tumbled from her grasp, spilling across the ground in a pale cascade. It was a small accident, a simple mistake born of exhaustion. But to Grizz, in front of the silent lord, it was a mortal offense. "Useless rat!" the overseer roared, his face purpling with rage. He descended upon the girl, his whip already in his hand. The first blow struck her across the back, and she screamed, a thin, piercing sound of pure agony. Elara did not think. She did not weigh the consequences. She saw the whip rise again, and a force stronger than fear moved her feet. She threw herself in front of Lyra's small, cowering form, her arms spread wide as if to absorb the blow herself. She closed her eyes, bracing for the searing pain. But it never came. There was a sound, a sharp crack, but it was not the sound of leather on flesh. It was the sound of the whip being stopped in mid-air. Elara opened her eyes. Lord Kalin was there, standing directly in front of her. His gauntleted hand had caught the whip just inches from her face. He held it effortlessly, the leather trembling in his iron grip. Grizz stared, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly melted into raw terror. He tried to pull the whip back, but it was immovable, held fast by a strength he could not comprehend. The Lord of the Keep had not made a sound, yet his action screamed through the silent mine. Kalin's Gaze fell from Grizz's terrified face to Elara. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were not cold or angry. For the first time, the narrator could see past the stoic mask. Kalen had seen the girl fall, he had seen the overseer's predictable cruelty, but he had not expected this. He had not expected to see one broken soul offer up her own body to shield another. In this pit of absolute despair, he was witnessing an act of selfless protection. It was a flicker of light so pure and unexpected it pierced through the years of his own guilt and silence. He did not see a slave. He saw a soul. His gaze held Elara's for a long moment. He saw her fear, but beneath it, he saw the unwavering defiance of a gentle heart. It was a strength he had forgotten existed. In that place of utter hopelessness, a single act of courage had just rewritten a woman's destiny. If you believe a person's true character is revealed in their darkest hour, press the like button to honor her bravery. Slowly, deliberately, Lord Kalen released the whip, letting it fall into the dust. He raised his hand and pointed one finger at Elara. Then he turned that same hand and pointed toward the two stone-faced guards who stood behind him. The command was absolute, though no one but he understood its true meaning. He had not condemned her. He had claimed her. He reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out a single heavy gold coin. It glittered in the gloom of the mine before he tossed it at Grizz's feet. The overseer flinched as if he had been struck. The coin was an insult, a dismissal. It was more than a mine worker's life was worth, and it declared that this girl, this nameless piece of property, was now priceless. Without another glance, Lord Kalen turned and began to walk away. His guards moved toward Elara, their faces impassive. She was frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been spared the whip, only to be chosen by the monster everyone feared. One of the guards gave her a slight nudge, a silent order to follow. She looked back at the terrified face of Lyra, then at the stunned overseer. She had been bought. Her chains had not been broken, merely transferred to a new, more powerful master. As she took the first hesitant step out of the pit and toward the silent, retreating figure of the Lord, a single, terrifying question echoed in her mind. Had she just been saved, or had she been dragged from one hell only to be delivered into another? The walk from the mine was a journey between worlds. Elara followed the silent Lord, her bare feet stumbling over the rocky path, his guards flanking her like two pillars of stone. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was his property now, a thing he had purchased with a single gold coin. Her life belonged to him, and she had no idea what he intended to do with it. They approached Blackwood Keep, and it rose from the earth like a shard of granite, a fortress built to keep the world at bay. It was as stark and imposing as its master. There were no banners, no bright colors, only gray stone and the sharp lines of defensive walls. The great wooden doors opened without a sound, swallowing them into the gloom within. The air inside was cool and still. Her footsteps, and those of the guards, echoed in the cavernous entrance hall. The only sounds in a world of profound quiet. An elderly woman with a face as impassive as the castle. Walls greeted them with a simple, deferential bow. She did not speak. No one did. Lord Kalen gave the woman a barely perceptible nod before melting into the shadows of a long corridor, vanishing from sight. He had not looked at Elara once since they left the mine. The old woman gestured for Elara to follow. She led her up a winding stone staircase and down a quiet hall, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. She stopped before a simple wooden door, opened it, and stood aside, indicating that Elara should enter. The room was small and sparse, but it was the most beautiful place Elara had ever seen. There was a bed, not a pile of filthy straw, but a real bed with a mattress and clean, mended linens. A wooden table held a ceramic basin filled with clear, fresh water and a rough-spun towel. A small, high window, barred but clean, let in a sliver of gray daylight. Compared to the filth and despair of the mine barracks, It was a palace. The old woman placed a folded bundle of clothes on. The bed, a simple brown tunic and leggings, clean and coarse, before backing out of the room and closing the door with a soft click. And then Elara was alone. The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed in on her so total and complete that her ears began to ring. She stood frozen in the center of the room, listening for the sounds that had defined her existence, the crack of a whip, the groans of pain, the shouted orders of the overseer. But there was nothing, only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Slowly, hesitantly, she moved toward the basin of water. She dipped her hands in, the coolness a shocking and welcome sensation. She splashed the water on her face, washing away the layers of grime and salt dust. With each splash she felt as if she were washing away a piece of the mind, reclaiming a small part of herself. She looked at her reflection in the water. A stranger with haunted eyes and a gaunt face stared back at her. But it was her face, her own. The silence began to change. What was at first unnerving soon became a balm. It was a thick protective blanket, insulating her from the cruelty of the world she had just left. No one was watching her with contempt. No one was waiting for her to make a mistake. The quiet was not empty, it was peaceful. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not being judged. The knot of fear in her stomach began to loosen, strand by painful strand. With that release came a wave of exhaustion so profound it buckled her knees. It was a weariness that went deeper than her aching muscles and bruised skin. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had been in a constant state of terror for too long. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with the aftershocks of her ordeal. She touched the clean linen, a simple texture that felt like an impossible luxury. She did not cry. She was too tired for tears. She simply sat, letting the quiet of the room seep into her bones. Later, the old woman returned with a wooden tray. On it was a bowl of thick stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a mug of water. She set it on the table and left without a word. Elara ate slowly, methodically, the warm food a comfort in her empty stomach. It was the most satisfying meal of her life. She had been saved from the mine. That much was true. But what came next remained a terrifying mystery. After she finished eating, she walked to the small window and peered out. From this vantage point, she could see a bleak stone courtyard below, and there, standing alone in the center of the empty space, was Lord Calin. He was not looking up. He was staring at nothing, a solitary figure lost in a world of his own creation. He was not the monster from the mine. He was not the fearsome lord of her imagination. In the lonely silence of his own home, he simply looked broken. And for the first time since she had been sold, Elara felt something other than fear for the man who now owned her. She felt a flicker of profound and unsettling curiosity. Days in Blackwood Keep settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. Elara was given simple tasks by the elderly housekeeper, Morwen. She swept dusty corridors, mended linens, and tended to the small overgrown herb garden in the courtyard. The work was a comfort, a gentle routine that allowed her mind to heal while her body recovered. Lord Calin remained a distant, silent presence. She would catch glimpses of him in the shadowy halls or walking alone on the battlements, a solitary king in a quiet kingdom. Her hands, though no longer subjected to the brutality of the mine, were still a testament to her past. The skin was rough and scarred, the knuckles raw and prone to cracking in the cold air. She would often hide them in the folds of her tunic, ashamed of their coarseness. One evening, after a long day of pulling weeds from the garden, she returned to her room to find a small, gray ceramic pot on her bedside table. It had not been there that morning. She lifted it hesitantly. Inside was a thick green balm that smelled of lavender and mint. Dipping a finger in, she found it was cool and soothing. She rubbed the balm into her chapped hands, and the relief was immediate, a gentle extinguishing of a fire that had burned for months. As she looked up, she caught a flicker of movement in the darkened doorway. It was him. Lord Calin stood there for a single breathless moment before turning and disappearing back into the silence, leaving behind only his unspoken act of care. A few days later, seeking warmth from the autumn chill, Elara found her way into the castle's vast and dusty library. She could not read the words on the pages, but the books were filled with beautiful, detailed illustrations. She was captivated, running her fingers over drawings of constellations, mythical beasts, and ancient maps. She spent the longest time with a heavy leather-bound volume on botany, fascinated by the intricate drawings of flowers and herbs. From the high-shadowed gallery above, Kaelin watched her. He saw the gentle curiosity in her eyes, the way her finger traced the lines of a drawing, as if trying to absorb its meaning through touch. He saw a mind eager for a world that had been denied to it. The following afternoon, Elara returned to the library. There, on a large reading table, the heavy botany book lay open. She approached it with a sense of wonder. It was open to a page with a series of detailed illustrations. She recognized them instantly. They were the lavender and mint plants from the garden, the very herbs she had smelled in the healing balm. A soft gasp escaped her lips. This was not a coincidence. This was a message, a silent conversation. A change began to take root in Elara's heart. This silent, brooding man was not just her keeper. He was communicating with her in the only way he knew how. She felt a growing desire to answer, to speak back in his silent language. While mending a pile of clothes, she came across one of his dark tunics. It had a small fraying tear near the cuff, an imperfection Morwen had missed. With meticulous care, Elara repaired it, her stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Her next project was the row of neglected plants in the great hall. Their leaves were brown and wilting in their pots. Day by day she tended to them, carefully trimming the dead leaves, turning their soil, and giving them water. It was her own quiet way of breathing life back into the dormant heart of the keep. Kaelin noticed. He would walk through the hall, and his gaze would linger on the new green shoots. He would run a finger over the perfectly mended cuff of his tunic. He never acknowledged her work with a look or a nod, but she knew that he saw. Then the first deep cold of winter arrived. It descended upon the keep like a shroud, and the stone walls seemed to radiate a damp chill. Elara's small room was drafty, her single wool blanket no match for the creeping cold. She lay shivering in her bed one night, curled into a tight ball for warmth. Just after midnight, the soft creak of her door opening sent a jolt of fear through her. A large silhouette filled the doorway. It was Lord Kaelin. He stepped into the room, and for a moment the old terror returned. But he did not approach her bed. He walked to the foot of it, and with a quiet rustle of fabric, he unfolded the heavy fur-lined cloak he so often wore. He laid it gently over her shivering form, its deep weight a sudden and profound comfort. The cloak carried the faint, clean scent of wood smoke and leather. It was the scent of him, of protection. He lingered for only a second before leaving as silently as he had come. Elara pulled the heavy cloak up to her chin, burrowing into its warmth. The fear was gone, replaced by a feeling so new and overwhelming she could not put a name to it. She was being cared for. She, who had been sold and forgotten, was being treated as something precious, something worth protecting from the cold. Weeks passed in this quiet dialogue. A fragile trust was built, a bridge of silent gestures across the gulf of their experiences. Elara no longer felt like a prisoner. She felt like a presence, a part of the castle's quiet rhythm. One day, her duties done, she found herself wandering down a corridor she had not explored before. It was colder here, dustier. At the very end of the hall was a single heavy oak door, bound with iron and fitted with a large ornate lock. Unlike the rest of the castle, which felt dormant, this wing felt sealed. A palpable sadness seemed to cling to the air around the door, a deep and ancient sorrow. She reached out and touched the cold iron of the lock. This was different. This was not a place that was simply unused. It was a place that was being contained. And she knew with a sudden, bone-deep certainty that whatever secret was locked away behind that door was the true source of its master's unending, sorrowful silence. To understand the silence of Lord Callan, one must first understand the man he used to be. He was not born to a quiet life. Years ago he was Lord Commander Callan, a man whose voice carried the weight of authority across battlefields. His words were his greatest weapon, sharp, decisive, and trusted by the king himself. He was a leader, respected and admired, a man on a path to greatness. But a single night, a single command, had turned that voice to ash in his mouth. It was during the border skirmishes in the south. The campaign was failing, and pressure from the crown was immense. His subordinate, a sharp and ambitious young baron named Valerius, brought him intelligence. It was a detailed report of an enemy munitions cache, hidden in an abandoned farmhouse, ready to supply a morning ambush. The intelligence was clean, precise, and promised a swift victory that could turn the tide of the conflict. Trusting his man, Callan gave the order to have the farmhouse burned. He watched from a distant hill as his men descended, but the sound that rose on the night air was not the thunderous explosion of munitions. It was the terrified screaming of people, of a family. Through his spyglass, with dawning horror, Callan saw the truth. It was not a munition store, it was a home. Valerius's intelligence had not just been wrong, it had been a lie, a deliberate one designed to remove a rival. As the flames consumed the house, one sound cut through the roar of the fire and the cries of the adults. It was the high, thin wail of a child. That sound was the last thing Lord Commander Callan truly heard. It silenced the world. He returned from the campaign a broken man, resigned his commission, and took a vow of silence, a penance for the lives his voice had destroyed. He locked his words away, convinced he was unworthy of ever speaking again. In the present, Elara found herself increasingly drawn to the locked door at the end of the western wing. It called, to her, a silent testament to a pain she was beginning to understand was far deeper than her own. She knew she should not pry, that a guest in her precarious position had no right to the secrets of the Lord. But her empathy, the very core of her nature, urged her to know the source of his wound. One afternoon she found the heavy door was no longer perfectly sealed. It was slightly ajar, the iron latch resting just shy of its lock. Her heart pounded. This was a line she should not cross. Yet she pushed it gently. The door swung inward with a low groan, revealing the dark, still room beyond. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The room was kept like a shrine. It was clean of dust, the air cold and preserved. There was no furniture save for a single small table in the center of the floor. And on that table sat one object, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its head tilted as if in mid-song. A lark. It was a thing of simple, innocent beauty, a stark contrast to the oppressive sadness of the room. It felt like a memory given form. She did not hear him approach. The sound of the door closing behind her was the only warning she had. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Lord Callan stood there, his face a mask of stone. But as his gaze fell upon her, then, to the wooden bird on the table, the mask shattered. It was not anger that fluttered his eyes. It was a wave of pure, undiluted agony. For the first time, she saw the full, horrifying depth of his suffering. His carefully constructed walls of silence and control crumbled, revealing the wounded man trapped inside. His breath hitched, a silent, ragged sound of a soul being torn open, anew. He did not speak. He did not move toward her. His eyes were locked on the bird. After a long, torturous moment, he walked slowly to the table. His hand, the same hand that had caught a whip and left her a healing balm, trembled as he reached for the carving. He picked it up with a reverence that was heartbreaking, his fingers closing around the smooth wood as if it were a last precious link to a world he had lost forever. He closed his eyes, his jaw tight, lost in a memory she could now feel but not see. Then the moment was over. He opened his eyes, the mask of control slowly sliding back into place, though his gaze remained haunted. He turned and walked out of the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The sound of the lock clicking firmly back into place echoed in the sudden emptiness. Elara was left alone in the corridor, her own heart aching with a shared, unspoken grief. She had not been punished. She had been shown the heart of his pain. She finally understood. His silence was not a rejection of the world. It was a cage he had built around a single, unbearable memory, a fortress to contain a pain too vast for words. A fragile new understanding settled between them in the following days, a quiet peace born not of care, but of shared sorrow. This delicate truce was shattered by the arrival of a rider bearing the king's seal. A steward approached Lord Callan in the great hall, bowing low. "My lord," the steward announced, his voice betraying a slight nervousness, "an honored guest has arrived on urgent business from the capital, Baron Valerius." Elara, standing nearby, did not know the name, but she saw Lord Callan's reaction. His posture became rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. His face was once again a mask of impenetrable stone, but in his eyes a violent storm had returned. The ghost from his past, the architect of his pain, was no longer just a memory. He was here. Baron Valerius swept into the great hall of Blackwood Keep like a vibrant poison. He was dressed in rich velvets of crimson and gold, a stark contrast to the muted grays and browns of the castle. He smiled, but his smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He moved with a restless energy, his gaze darting around the hall, taking in the stone, the shadows, and the silence with an air of mocking appraisal. He stopped before Lord Callan, who stood as still and silent as a statue carved from mountain rock. "Callan, my old friend," Valerius said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "It has been too long. Still enjoying the quiet life, I see." The words were friendly, but the tone was laced with condescending pity. Callan did not react, his face an impassive mask, but the air around him grew thick with a tension that was almost visible. It was then that Valerius's gaze fell upon Elara. She had been standing near the hearth, and his eyes lit up with a cruel, predatory interest. He walked toward her, circling her as if inspecting a curious new animal. Elara instinctively took a step back, her heart beginning to pound with a familiar, sickening rhythm of fear. "Well, what have we here?" Valerius purred, looking her up and down. He noted her simple, clean clothes and the way she held herself with a quiet dignity. "I heard a rumor you had acquired a pet from the mines, but I must say she cleans up surprisingly well for mine filth." Elara flinched as if struck. The Baron laughed, a low, unpleasant sound. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me, does she speak for you? A pretty voice to replace the one you lost?" The insult hung in the air, vile and sharp. Elara could feel the heat of Callan's fury from across the room, a silent, raging inferno. She saw his hands clench into tight fists at his sides, the only sign of the storm brewing within him. Valerius, satisfied with his verbal sting, turned his attention back to Callan, feigning a businesslike demeanor. "The king sends his regards, of course. He is, however, growing concerned. The output from the Viridia mines has slowed. He worries that your solitude may be affecting your judgment." It was a clear threat, wrapped in the guise of royal concern. Valerius was reminding Callan of the power he now wielded. He controlled the narrative at court. He could paint Callan as an eccentric recluse, a madman unfit to govern his own lands. "One must be careful with new distractions," Valerius continued, his eyes flicking back to Elara. "Attachments are so fragile. The mines, you know, are always hungry for more workers. It would be a shame for such a creature to be sent back to the darkness. But these things can be arranged. One word from me to the crown, and she would be gone by morning." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a dagger laid bare on the table between them. Elara finally understood. This man, with his cruel smile and silken words, held her life in his hands. The fragile safety she had found in this silent castle was an illusion, one that could be shattered with a single word from him. Her sanctuary was about to become her prison once more. The fragile peace that two broken souls had carefully built was now directly threatened by the architect of their original pain. Evil, it seems, cannot stand to see happiness in places it has sown with sorrow. If you believe their quiet world is worth fighting for, subscribe to our channel to witness if they can stand against the coming storm. Valerius seemed to revel in the tense silence, in the fear he had created. He had delivered his message. He had asserted his dominance. With a final dismissive glance at Elara, he turned to leave the hall, his work for the day done. As he passed the table where the small, potted plant that Elara had so carefully nursed back to health now sat, he paused. It was the plant she had brought back from the brink, a small symbol of the life she had coaxed back into the keep. With a movement that looked almost accidental, he brushed against the table. The ceramic pot teetered on the edge. Time seemed to slow. Valerius stopped, a cruel, knowing smirk playing on his lips. He looked from the wobbling pot to Elara's horrified face, and then to Kaelin, his eyes gleaming with challenge. The small life, the little piece of hope she had cultivated, was about to be shattered on the stone floor, and he was going to enjoy every second of it. It was a final petty act of cruelty, a promise of the greater destruction he was capable of. The world narrowed to the small ceramic pot, wobbling precariously on the edge of the table. To Valerius, it was a trifle, a tool for a moment's petty amusement, but to Elara, it was everything. It was the life she had coaxed from wilting. Leaves, the first beautiful thing she had nurtured in this quiet castle. She held her breath, her hands clenched, watching the small symbol of her fragile peace about to be shattered on the cold stone floor. But Kaelin's eyes were not on the pot. They were on Elara. He saw the terror on her face, the way her body tensed as if she herself were about to fall and break. In that instant, he understood. The plant did not matter. Her peace did. Before the pot could fall, he moved. His stride was not rushed, but deliberate and unstoppable, a force of nature awakening. He did not lunge for the table. He walked past it, ignoring the object completely, and placed himself directly between Valerius and Elara. He was a living wall, a shield of flesh and bone. His message was clear and silent. She was what he was protecting, not the pot. Valerius watched, his smirk unwavering, amused by this display of mute chivalry. Kaelin turned from him and walked to a nearby table where his slate and a piece of chalk lay waiting. The only sound in the vast, silent hall was the soft scrape of his boots on the stone. He picked up the chalk, his movements measured, almost ceremonial. The sound of the chalk against the slate was loud in the tense air, a dry, scratching whisper that demanded attention. He turned back to Valerius and held the slate up for him to read. The letters were stark and clear. "She is the lady of this keep. You will apologize." Valerius stared at the words for a moment before bursting into a short, ugly laugh. "The mute lord issues a decree?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "And who, pray tell, will make me? You? You can't even speak your own name. Your guards follow the king's commands, and I speak for the king here." Kaelin's expression did not change. He calmly lowered the slate and wiped it clean with the palm of his hand, the gesture erasing not just the words, but Valerius's mockery along with them. He began to write again, the scratching sound. More intense this time, each letter carved with the weight of years of silent suffering. When he was done, he held the slate up once more. "I remember the fire, and I remember your report." The change in Valerius was instantaneous and absolute. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly white. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure animal panic. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Elara did not understand the words, but she understood their effect. She was witnessing a predator become prey. The Lord of Blackwood Keep had just unsheathed a blade of memory, and it had struck a mortal blow. "That's a lie," Valerius stammered, his smooth voice cracking. "A madman's fantasy. You have no proof." He took a step back, his bravado crumbling into dust. "Guards! My guards! "Seize this traitor!" The two men who had accompanied Valerius moved forward, but they were stopped instantly by Kalen's own household guards. The men of Blackwood Keep, who had served their silent master with unwavering devotion for years, formed a silent, unbreachable line. Their faces were grim, their loyalty absolute. They did not draw their swords. They simply stood, a wall of quiet defiance. They had made their choice. Valerius was alone, trapped in the center of the hall, his authority utterly dissolved. One of Kalen's guards, a man with a face like a weathered stone, walked to the great hall doors and pulled one of them open, the gesture a silent command, "Leave." Rage and humiliation twisted Valerius's features into an ugly snarl. He shot a look of pure hatred at Kalen and then at Elara. "This isn't over," he hissed, the threat empty and pathetic. He stormed across the hall, his fine velvet cloak swirling around him like a shroud of his own defeated pride. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the hall like a thunderclap, and then there was silence once more. But this was a new kind of silence. It was not empty or sad. It was a silence of victory, of peace restored, of justice served. Elara looked at Kalen, truly seeing him for the first time. He had not used his fists or a sword. He had used the truth. He had taken the very source of his pain, the memory that had kept him prisoner for years, and wielded it as a shield to protect her. The immense courage of it took her breath away. The tension finally left his body, and his broad shoulders slumped slightly with the effort of the confrontation. He turned to her, and his eyes, stormy and deep, were filled with a universe of unspoken emotion. The external threat was gone, banished from their walls. All that remained was the two of them, standing in the quiet hall, the air thick with everything that had just happened. This was a different kind of precipice. She knew with absolute certainty that she could not let this moment pass. She took a single deliberate step toward him, her heart no longer filled with fear, but with a powerful and overwhelming need to bridge the final distance between them. The great hall, which had moments before been a battlefield of wills, fell into a profound quiet. The household staff, with an unspoken understanding, had melted back into the shadows, leaving the cavernous space to its lord and his lady. The air itself seemed to exhale, releasing the last vestiges of tension. The threat was gone. The ghost had been banished. Kalen stood for a long moment, his gaze lost in the middle distance, as if watching the last of Valerius's poison drain from his home. Then, without a glance at Elara, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of the battle he had just won. He did not go to his chambers. He went to the library. Elara followed. She moved without hesitation, her purpose clear. This was not over. The most important part was yet to come. She found him standing before the great stone fireplace, staring into the flickering flames. His back was to her, but she could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the posture of a man holding himself together after a great shattering. His slate dangled from one hand, a forgotten shield from a battle that was already won. She approached him silently, her soft shoes making no sound on the thick carpets. The library was their sanctuary, the place where he had first shared a piece of his world with her through the pages of a book. It was fitting that it would be the stage for this final, quiet confession. When she was just behind him, she stopped. He did not turn, but she knew he was aware of her presence. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing against his as she took the slate from his hand. He released it without resistance. She turned and placed it on a heavy oak table with a soft, final click. The sound was an abdication, a declaration that his vow of silence, his penance, had been served. It was no longer needed here, not with her. She returned to him, her gaze soft with an empathy that ran deeper than words. She looked at his hand, the one that had held the chalk that wrote the truth. It was a commander's hand, scarred and calloused, a hand that had known violence and power. But it was also the hand that had caught a whip to save her, the hand that had gently placed a cloak over her while she slept. With a courage born of love, she took his hand in both of hers. She did not speak. She simply held it, her small hands enveloping his, offering, a silent comfort, a shared strength. It was not the gesture of a servant to a lord or a ward to a guardian. It was the touch of an equal, a partner offering harbor after a long and terrible storm. At her touch, a tremor ran through him. He slowly turned his head to look at her, and in his eyes she saw it all. The gratitude, the relief, the years of crushing loneliness, and a love so fierce and profound it was breathtaking. The walls he had built around his heart, the fortress of his silence, came crumbling down. He was utterly vulnerable before her, and in his eyes she saw her own reflection, the woman who had, against all odds, found the key to his locked soul. Slowly, with a reverence that made her heart ache, he raised his other hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fingers hovering near her cheek. A silent question. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His touch, when it came, was as soft as a whisper. He gently tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear, his thumb brushing against her skin. It was a touch that spoke of adoration, of wonder, of a future he had never believed he would have. He drew a breath, a rough, shuddering sound, the sound of a machine starting after years of disuse. His lips, which she had only ever seen pressed into a firm, grim line, parted slightly. She watched, her own breath caught in her chest, as he gathered all of his will, all of his courage, all of his love, and pushed past the scar tissue of his past. And then he spoke. It was a single word, hoarse and cracked with disuse, like stone grinding against stone. It was quiet, yet it filled the entire library, echoing in the space between them with the force of 1,000 declarations. It was her name. Elara? Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of his face. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming it felt like a physical force. He had not just spoken her name, he had given her his voice. He had taken the most broken part of himself and offered it to her as a gift. In that moment, he was no longer the mute lord, the lord of penance or the master of the keep. He was simply Calin, and she was his. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, as the firelight danced across their faces. The silence of Blackwood Keep had not been broken. It had been transformed. It was no longer a sound of absence and pain, but a deep, peaceful quiet filled with the unspoken promise of a new life, a shared future, and a love that had finally found its voice. In the days that followed, a new purpose settled over Blackwood Keep. With Elara by his side, her quiet strength a constant source of courage, Calin penned a long and detailed report to the king. He wrote not with the anger of a wronged man, but with the calm clarity of a commander once more. He detailed Valerius's betrayal on the battlefield years ago, the lie that had cost innocent lives, and his recent threats and abuses of power at the Viridia mines. He sealed the letter with his own sigil, an emblem that had not been used in years, and sent it with his most trusted writer. The king's justice was swift and absolute. A royal decree arrived weeks later, not with a whisper, but with the force of a storm. Baron Valerius was publicly stripped of his titles, his lands, and his wealth. His web of lies had unraveled completely. The final act of his poetic justice was a sentence of hard labor. He was marched in chains to the very salt mines he had ruled with such terror, destined to live out his days in the same darkness he had inflicted upon so many others. There was one last thread from the past to be addressed. Elara's father, Bren, was brought to the keep. He stood before her in the great hall, a stooped and broken man, his eyes downcast with shame. Elara looked at him, not with the anger of the girl he had sold, but with the quiet wisdom of the lady she had become. She did not offer him rage or retribution. She offered him a difficult grace. "I forgive you for your weakness," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But forgiveness does not erase the need for a lesson learned." He was not cast out or imprisoned. He was given a room, warm meals, and a position as a stable hand. He would spend his days learning the dignity of honest work, the value of caring for another living creature, a simple truth he had forgotten in his moment of greed. Justice, like a garden, must be tended with a firm but gentle hand. With the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest, a new chapter had begun for Blackwood Keep, one built on truth, courage, and a love that had found its voice in the quietest of places. If this story of healing and hope has touched your heart, share it, so that others may be reminded that even after the longest winter, spring will always return. Years passed, and the seasons of healing transformed the cold stone of Blackwood Keep. The silence remained, but it was no longer the silence of sorrow. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet filled with the gentle sounds of life. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, warming halls that were now decorated with vibrant tapestries and vases of fresh flowers. The heart of the keep was the central courtyard, once a bleak expanse of stone, now a lush and vibrant garden. Roses climbed the ancient walls, and bees hummed over beds of lavender and mint. Here, in the warm afternoon sun, sat Elara. She was the lady of the keep, her face serene, her movements full of a gentle confidence. On her lap sat a small boy of 5, with his father's dark hair and a bright, curious smile. His name was Rowan. In her hands, Elara held the familiar heavy botany book. Her finger rested on a detailed illustration of a larkspur. "And this one," she said softly, "is for courage." Rowan looked up at the drawing, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Courage," he repeated, his small voice clear and confident. A shadow fell over them, and Elara looked up, her face breaking into a warm smile. Calin stood there, no longer the haunted lord, but a husband and father. He had never become a man of many words. It was not his nature. But the words he chose were always true, and his silence was now a comfortable and loving presence. He placed a large, gentle hand on her shoulder, and she leaned back into his touch, a familiar and easy gesture. He looked down at their son, a soft pride in his eyes. "He has your spirit," Calin said, his voice a low, warm rumble, no longer marred by disuse. Elara smiled, covering his hand with her own. "But he has your strong heart." Calin looked from his son to his wife, his gaze encompassing his entire world, the future he never thought he would have. He bent down and pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "He has our peace," he corrected gently. Rowan, seeing his parents, reached up a small hand for each of them. They stood together, a family of 3, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon, surrounded by the life they had cultivated together. The fortress of solitude had become a sanctuary of love. The silence was finally and forever filled, not with noise, but with a deep and abiding serenity.